Hello, everyone. My name is John Packer, and I'm the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center and a professor of law at the University of Ottawa. Bonjour tout le monde, je m'appelle John Packer. Je suis le directeur du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement de droit de la personne et un professeur dans la faculté de droit à l'Université d'Ottawa. It's my great pleasure to welcome today our great panel of contributors and to all who are joining us for the second annual David Petrasek Memorial Forum. Of course, it's with heavy heart that we reflect in the second David Petrasek Forum on Professor Petrasek's passing, a great loss to us a year ago at the Faculty of Law, at the University of Ottawa, and in the human rights movement, I would say globally, where he played such an important role. And he was not only a wonderful colleague, but also a dear friend. Today, we've got a great subject, timely. We've got really top-notch contributors. And so before I pass the moderation to my colleague who will continue with the program, let me first of all acknowledge the Indigenous land from which I'm addressing you at the University of Ottawa. We pay respect to the Algonquin people, or Anishinaabe, as in their own language, who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge a long-standing relationship with the territory, which remains unceded. And we pay respect to all Indigenous people and the peoples in the region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. Let me also acknowledge our co-sponsors of today's event, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, of which Professor Petrasek was a well-known and beloved member, the Dialogue Advisory Group in Amsterdam, and the World Refugee and Migration Council. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Linda Collins, who is a full professor in the Faculty of Law. She's also a member of the Center for Environmental Law and Global Sustainability here at the University of Ottawa. She's a well-known expert on environmental human rights at both the domestic and international level. And I'm delighted, including constitutional matters, I'm delighted to let you know that she has just recently published, I think very recently, in the last month or so, if I'm not mistaken, Professor Collins, a great new book I commend to everyone titled The Ecological Constitution, published by Routledge. So with that, Professor Collins, please take the floor, so we say.
Thank you, Professor Packer. Merci et bienvenue à tous et à toutes. Vous êtes très bienvenus aujourd'hui. It's really a privilege for me to be here among such a distinguished panel of people doing such important and timely work. This topic is obviously top of mind for many of us, and I think these conversations are more important than they've ever been. So with that in mind, I don't plan to take up too much of your time. I'm going to offer brief introductions of each speaker before they talk. I'm sure everyone will keep to the time, but if not, I'll just give a little wave or put a comment in the chat to remind you. And then at the conclusion of our speakers' remarks, we'll open it up to what will hopefully be a very active and vigorous Q&A session. So our first speaker this morning is Ms. Cecilia Jimenez Damari. Ms. Jimenez Damari was appointed Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons by the Human Rights Council in 2016. She's a lawyer in human rights and international humanitarian law, specialized in forced displacement and migration, with over 3 decades of experience in NGO human rights advocacy for the Asia-Pacific region, among many other wonderful accomplishments. So we're very honored to have you here this morning, and I will turn it over to you, Cecilia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Collins, and thank you again for this invitation. This invitation actually means a lot to me, particularly because of the memory of David Petrasek, who was a colleague in the human rights circles and a very dear friend. We last saw each other in person, actually, in the halls of the United Nations Human Rights Council, when I had just started my term as the UN Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights of IDPs, and he was excited to set up a lecture the year after that I can give to the students he had brought over, that he brings over from Canada to Geneva. Indeed, we miss David a lot. So this event therefore relates to issues close to his research, to his advocacy and concern. And I am very happy to speak here amidst the esteemed academicians, actually as a practitioner, that's me, on issues in relation to the importance of centering a human rights framework in discussions on human mobility in the context of climate change. Indeed, human mobility in the context of climate change can take many forms, and when it pertains to the context of slow onset adverse effects of climate change, this can take the form of displacement, migration, planned relocation, can be internal, can be cross-border. In most cases, movement is not entirely voluntary or forced, but rather falls somewhere in the continuum between the two, with different degrees of voluntariness and constraint. At the same time, and I would like to insist this, where such voluntariness is absent, such mobility would fall squarely in the notion of forced displacement or displacement where people are obliged to leave. In many cases, movement can be an effective adaptation strategy and prevent arbitrary displacement. People are displaced when they are obliged to leave because they can no longer adapt to the changing climate and they have no option other than to leave when, for example, an area has become uninhabitable and too dangerous for human habitation. Where internal displacement is concerned, of course, and that's the theme of my human rights mandate in the United Nations, my report to the UN General Assembly in 2020 focuses on internal displacement in the context of slow onset adverse effects of climate change, where I emphasize the necessity of both, first, adopting a human rights-based approach, and second, mainstreaming this approach in discussions and all responses. The scope of my report to the GAs focus on internal displacement and, as I said, the slow onset adverse effects of climate change in order to increase the attention to the so-called less dramatic effects, but that over time have tremendous effects and consequences, including internal displacement on the daily lives and futures of affected populations. Among the examples are rising sea levels, melting of glaciers, desertification. And the guiding principles on internal displacement, which is a normative framework for human rights in IHL for IDPs, clearly stipulate that disasters may be a cause of internal displacement. The slow onset adverse effects of climate change indeed can turn into a disaster. Moreover, the guiding principles likewise provide that internally displaced persons may be persons who are obliged and not necessarily be forced to leave their homes. Human mobility, as linked to the adverse effects of climate change, including displacement, is actually expected to increase significantly over coming years and decades, and most displaced persons are expected to remain within national borders. The impacts of displacement on the enjoyment of human rights are extensive, and particularly the widespread impacts of climate change on the rights to life, health, housing, food, water, and education, cultural rights, and collective rights, including the rights of indigenous peoples and their exercise of the right to self-determination. They also affect people's rights to freedom of movement. healthcare, and education, among others. In short, those impacts contribute to displacement, and displacement further impacts the enjoyment of human rights. Under the guiding principles which reflect international human rights law and IHL, those human rights guarantees are restated comprehensively from the context of prevention, protection, and durable solutions for displaced persons, and are applicable to such situations. Slow onset processes can also compound other displacement drivers, unfortunately, such as intercommunal tensions, violence, and armed conflict. The intersecting risks of climate change and armed conflict heighten the vulnerability of people and communities and undermine their adaptive capacity, increasing the risk of displacement. So internal displacement in this context poses particular challenges and needs increased attention. While climate change is global, however, its adverse effects and related mobility affect people differently. The Task Force on Disaster Displacement of the UNFCCC indeed has said that the climate change can turn into a disaster displacement, therefore posing direct risks to human rights. And they have actually stated it's important to identify two essential areas for consideration. The first is vulnerability of the persons impacted in terms of human rights, particularly those displaced. And the second is the enhancement of their political agencies. Communities, for example, living in certain areas, such as low-lying coastal areas, small island states, and Arctic ecosystems are more exposed to such events, and therefore at higher risk of disaster displacement. People whose livelihoods depend heavily on ecosystems, such as indigenous farmers, pastoralists, herders, fisherfolk, are affected more directly and at higher risk of displacement. And of course, they also intersect with gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, cultural background, and disability, resulting in differentiated impacts on different groups, exacerbating pre-existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. It is, however, at the same time, also very important to acknowledge the great agency of these groups. In many contexts, they display remarkable strength, resourcefulness, and resilience in the face of disasters and displacement, despite the challenges, barriers, and discrimination that they face. And they also have traditional knowledge and valuable perspectives that can contribute to the design of programmatic responses, disaster risk reduction strategies, and durable solutions. Affected communities in all their diversity must be an integral part of the response and solutions to such displacement as required by a human rights-based approach. Unfortunately, as we all know, the COVID-19 crisis has increased the vulnerability of communities to natural hazards, while climate change increases the frequency and intensity of natural hazards, and therefore they result to a higher risk of disaster and displacement. So my underlying and very, very basic principle message is that climate action undertaken in respect for human rights is essential to prevention, protection, and solutions for internal displacement, to guarantee the rights of internally displaced persons. As the human rights duty bearers, states must take action to protect people from the direct threats of life and other human rights impacts of foreseeable natural hazards and related displacement. It is crucial to enhance climate change mitigation and adaptation efforts and honor and increase commitments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, methane emissions, etc., to prevent human rights harms and the conditions leading to displacement associated with such adverse effects of climate change. States must also protect vulnerable groups from the adverse effects of climate change. Disaster risk reduction, preparedness, and climate change adaptation undertaken in respect of human rights should also integrate the specific challenges of internal displacement in the context of slow onset, and sudden onset adverse effects of climate change. And these are essential for an effective provision of humanitarian assistance, protection, and to support durable solutions in this context. States must also ensure the participation of such affected persons in decision-making, obtain their free and prior and informed consent, and ensure transparency and access to information, equality, non-discrimination, and accountability, and importantly, access to effective remedies. And such participation must be a rule rather than an exception in taking a human rights-centered approach to climate change and mobility. Now, I have 2 minutes left. And part of my tasks as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons is the work that I do to mainstream human rights into the UN, including the humanitarian system. As a member of the Interagency Standing Committee, we actually just issued a collective statement a few weeks ago where we urge governments to take certain specific practical measures towards climate change and mobility, underlying respect for human rights. Amongst this are ensure a focus on the most vulnerable and marginalized people in crisis. Listen to communities and grassroots leaders, particularly women, youth, and indigenous people, and engage them in decision-making and co-creating and owning solutions that put people, climate, and nature at the center of all actions. Invest in more effective preventative risk management and capacities at local level, and turn global commitments into effective local action that empowers those most at risk. Now, during the recently held COP26 in Glasgow, many advocates and observers either praised or lamented its outcomes, imaging the half glass empty and the half glass full. One thing is clear, much still need to be done, and climate action still cannot wait longer. I would like to end with a statement that the science of climate change is very clear and should be made clear to all of us. It is now essential to focus on the human rights, on the human beings and their human rights. The tasks are many, the arenas are multifold. So for David Petrasek, thank you for the initial work you have undertaken on these issues, and we continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Special Rapporteur Jimenez Damari, for that stirring and inspiring and incredibly substantive presentation. I'll turn the floor over now to Professor John Knox, who is Henry C. Larman Professor of International Law at Wake Forest University School of Law, and an internationally recognized expert on human rights law and international environmental law. Professor Knox served as the United Nations' first independent expert and then special rapporteur on the issue of human rights obligations related to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So he is particularly well positioned to comment on the topic of our seminar today. Welcome, Professor Knox.
Thank you very much, Linda, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this memorial forum for David Petrasek. I did not know David very well personally. I admired his work, especially in the Open Global Rights Forum magazine website, all of the things that it did, and he invited me to contribute to that on this actual topic on human rights and the environment during the course of my mandate. So I think this is a very appropriate and fitting way to remember him. So on the topic of human rights and the environment, I think the basic relationship between human rights and the environment, it's important to remember, is essentially interdependent. A healthy environment is necessary for the enjoyment of a vast range of human rights, including rights to life and health, but also the exercise of human rights, including, for example, rights to information, to public participation, to access to remedy, to freedom of expression and association. The exercise of all of those rights is really vital to protecting the environment. Now, there are two ways of recognizing this interdependent relationship. One way, and maybe the simpler way, is simply to recognize an freestanding human right to a healthy environment. But another way is to do what I've called greening other human rights. That is to take other human rights and apply them to environmental situations. The first approach, the simpler approach of simply recognizing a standalone human right to a healthy environment, was not taken at the United Nations at the beginning of the creation of the modern United Nations human rights system in 1948 with the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It wasn't taken then because, frankly, the environment just wasn't on the minds of people in 1948. It really took another 20 years or so for the modern environmental movement to really take off. Once it did, however, countries began to include the right to a healthy environment or some permutation of that right, some alternative formulation of that right. They began to include that right in their national constitutions. And so today, at least 100 national constitutions explicitly include a right to a healthy environment in their national laws or constitutions. Many other countries have recognized it in regional human rights treaties, in Africa, in the Americas, the ASEAN Declaration, a human rights instrument. Even in the European context, the Aarhus Convention includes a reference to the right to a healthy environment. The United Nations, when I talk about this until very recently, I had to say the United Nations had never recognized a right to a healthy environment. Now, happily, I can say they did not recognize it until September, October of this year at the most recent Human Rights Council session, which I'll get to in just a moment. But in the long period in which the United Nations did not recognize it, even though it was being recognized domestically and regionally, human rights bodies, international human rights bodies, began to green other human rights. This took place not only at the United Nations level through the work of special rapporteurs and treaty bodies, but really much more actively at the regional level through the work of regional human rights tribunals, including the European Court of Human Rights, the Inter-American Commission and Court, and the African Commission and Court of Human and People's Rights. And so these bodies were interpreting different instruments, different rights in different cases, but they essentially all decided that environmental harm could and did adversely affect the enjoyment of specific rights within their purview. So, for example, the European Court of Human Rights held that environmental harm interfered with the right to life and the right to private and family life. The African Commission issued a really important decision on the right to health. The Inter-American Commission focused more on non-discrimination and the rights of indigenous peoples and so forth. But over time, this began to create a kind of jurisprudence, a kind of growing environmental human rights law that in some ways was growing so rapidly that it was hard to really get a handle on. So in 2012, the Human Rights Council decided to appoint, as Linda just told you, a special mandate holder, an independent expert on human rights and the environment. And I had the honor of being chosen to fill that position. And the task given me was essentially to clarify this emerging area of law, to study the human rights obligations relating to the enjoyment of a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, and to describe them. In a series of reports over the next 3 years, I did that. What I did is essentially look to see what all of these different human rights bodies have been saying about environmental issues. And what I found was really a remarkable degree of consensus, despite the fact that they were interpreting such different, in many ways, instruments and obviously had different mandates. They were reaching extremely similar conclusions. And I summarized these conclusions first in a mapping report that I did for the Human Rights Council. And then after my mandate was extended in 2015, in 2018, I summarized them in what I called framework principles on human rights and the environment. And I won't go through all those framework principles now, but I'll just emphasize that what these human rights bodies found, or what they held, was that in order to protect against environmental harm to human rights, states have obligations to protect people within their purview, within their jurisdiction from this type of environmental harm. And these obligations fall into three main categories. There are obligations, there are procedural obligations, including to provide environmental information, to facilitate public participation in environmental decision-making, to provide remedies for violations, and so forth. There are also substantive obligations to adopt and implement effective environmental standards and to enforce them effectively against business enterprises and other private actors. Now, these substantive obligations give states somewhat more discretion than the procedural obligations do, in the sense that no one expects, a low-income state like Madagascar, say, to have exactly the same substantive environmental standards as a richer state like Denmark or Germany. But nevertheless, that discretion is not unlimited. States do have obligations to make sure, for example, that they're not discriminating, that they're applying the precautionary principle, that they're taking into account relevant international standards, and so forth. And then the third category, which cuts across the first two, is obligations to take into account the effects of environmental harm on those who are most at risk, most vulnerable, and most vulnerable situations. So as I said, I summarize these obligations. I set them out in framework principles on human rights. The Human Rights Council, I should say, was generally extremely, I would say, welcoming of the idea that human rights are relevant to environmental protection. They adopted all the resolutions on my mandate by consensus. And in 2018, at the end of my second term, they renewed the mandate again and appointed a new special rapporteur, David Boyd of the University of British Columbia, who continues to hold the position today. His mandate was renewed earlier this year. David is also charged with preparing an annual report to the UN General Assembly, which he has done, as well as to the UN Human Rights Council. This field has continued to take off. I mean, I could talk for a very long time about all the things that have happened just in the last couple of years. Let me just mention a couple of highlights. One is that in Latin America and the Caribbean, states adopted the Escazú Agreement, which is the first regional agreement outside of Europe to address environmental rights, that is, rights to information, participation, and remedy in an environmental context. But in some ways, it goes beyond the Aarhus Convention, which had done this already for Europe in 1998, by also addressing the rights of environmental human rights defenders. It makes clear, the Escazú Agreement makes clear that all of this is tied to the human right to a healthy environment. Human rights bodies, such as the Human Rights Committee that oversees compliance with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, have begun to issue really path-breaking reports, path-breaking decisions, I should say, on communications, holding states in violation of their obligations by not taking effective steps to protect against environmental harm. At the domestic level, perhaps the most important developments are with respect to climate change, which is certainly relevant to the topic today. A whole series of cases now apply human rights to or hold that states are violating their people's human rights by not effectively taking steps to reduce their climate emissions or climate change, or otherwise taking steps to address climate change. The most important of these decisions is probably still the Urgenda v. Netherlands case, which the Dutch Supreme Court decided in December of 2019. But Urgenda is being repeated and followed by many other cases around the world. The Human Rights Committee also issued the first decision, I think, yet on a climate migrant, the Te Teota decision, Te Teota v. New Zealand. Last year, the Human Rights Committee held that, although it wasn't holding yet that someone could not be sent back to a country because of the effects of climate change in that country, it was preparing the framework for saying that it would decide that quite soon unless conditions changed rather rapidly. Finally, I want to come back to what I said earlier. Just last month, the Human Rights Council, the United Nations Human Rights Council finally adopted for the first time a right to a healthy environment. This is something that both David and I had called for. Many other states and civil society organizations and people around the world have been working for this for a long time. It's really a rather remarkable decision. The Human Rights Council doesn't recognize new human rights very often at all. And this one had some opposition, but at the end of the day, no states voted against it. It was adopted without a single negative vote and only 4 abstentions. I expect that right will come up for consideration later this year, perhaps not this academic year, but within the coming months at the United Nations General Assembly. And we can talk in the question and answers, if you like, a little bit more about how that might work. But I think I'm out of time now, so I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Knox. And what a wonderfully optimistic note to end your presentation on. It's exciting to think about what's possible as the human rights system becomes increasingly engaged with our fundamentally ecological nature. Our next speaker is Alan Rock. Professor Rock is President Emeritus and a Professor of Law at the University of Ottawa. After several decades as a trial lawyer, he entered government and was a cabinet minister in Canada at the national level. He served as Minister of Justice and Attorney General of Canada, as Minister of Health and Minister of Industry and Infrastructure. And in 2003, he was appointed as Canadian Ambassador to the United Nations in New York, where he led the successful Canadian effort to secure unanimous adoption by UN member states of the responsibility to protect populations from genocide, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. We're very honored to have you here today, and I will turn the floor over to Professor Rock.
Thank you, Linda. I don't know if you could hear it, but my environment at the moment is contaminated by a fire alarm test in my building. It stopped for now, but if it restarts, I could be in competition with it to get your attention. Linda and colleagues, let me first of all say that taking part in this panel today is a special pleasure for me, not only because of the opportunity to participate with colleagues on this panel who are so very distinguished, but also because of the memory of the person who comes to mind today. I'm very proud to say that David Petrasek was not only a colleague, but a friend. And I knew him as a distinguished scholar, a gifted teacher, but also an activist with a very profound commitment to the protection and promotion of human rights of everyone, everywhere. We at the University of Ottawa, more than a year after his death, are still coming to terms with our loss. The invitation to participate in an event that is associated with David's name and memory is for me a deeply felt honor for which I'm very grateful. I've been asked to speak today about the changing nature of contemporary migration and refugee flows resulting from the lethal combination of climate change and violent conflict. In doing so, Linda, can you hear me all right?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, can you hear the fire alarm as well?
We can hear the fire alarm, but we can hear, it's just a call to action, really. It's underlining the urgency of the situation, I think.
Absolutely. Now, look, the fact is that I'm going to draw upon today the work of the World Refugee and Migration Council, which I've been associated with since its formation in 2017, under the leadership of Lloyd Axworthy. The council was created at the time the global compacts were entered into, because it was felt that the compacts, while valuable statements of principle, were at a very high level since they were negotiated on an intergovernmental basis. And what was needed was a more practical and political approach to identify specific measures needed to improve and address gaps and weaknesses in the global response to forced displacement. The underfunding of UNHCR, the lack of responsibility sharing, the lack of accountability, the lack of voices for refugees themselves in the process of the management of their affairs. And so the call to action report, which we published a couple of years ago, contains those recommendations, very political, very practical. We're in the process now of advocating their adoption by governments throughout the world, and I commend the report to everyone on this webinar. More than 30 years ago, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change observed that the single greatest effect of climate change could well be forced human migration. More recently, in 2019, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights asserted that climate change poses the greatest threats to human rights in the 21st century. As to conflict, it's too simplistic to say that climate change directly causes conflict, but it lays bare and it makes worse tensions arising from factors that can, in a sometimes complex interplay, ultimately lead to conflict. That is to say, competition for scarce resources, ethnic rivalries, or competing claims for the use of land. Here's a compelling example. A recent study in Africa found that an increase in temperature of 1 degree Celsius led to a 54% increase in the probability of conflict in places where there are both farmers and herders because of desertification and the shortage of arable land. That's in contrast to a 17% increase where those two groups did not coexist. Climate and conflict combine, as Cecilia was saying, to cause cascading consequences. Countries experiencing conflict are less able to cope with climate change precisely because their ability to adapt is weakened by that very conflict and often state failure as well. It should be noted that according to the International Committee of the Red Cross, of the 25 countries deemed most vulnerable to climate change, 14 are mired in conflict at present. If climate change and conflict have such a close relationship, a strong correlation, if not direct causation, where does displacement figure in the vital interdependence referred to in the title of today's discussion? To deal first with internal displacement, its most frequent cause was long thought to be conflict, but that is no longer so. The Global Report on Internal Displacement discloses that in 2019, 2,000 disasters triggered almost 25 million new internal displacements across 140 countries and territories. Almost all of those disasters were weather-related hazards, extreme events like storms and floods. I note that in many places, they were preemptive evacuations led by governments themselves, facing inevitable and imminent weather-related disasters. Those were internal displacements. As to cross-border displacements, the number of people fleeing their country in consequence of climate change continues to grow, according to UNHCR. And every year, they represent an increasing proportion of transnational migrants. UNHCR insists, of course, and rightly so, that they cannot be called refugees or climate refugees because they don't fall within the parameters of the 1951 Convention definition. So what do we call them? And how do we deal with them? Transnational migrants escaping the consequences of climate change in their own countries. A project launched by cooperating governments and called the Nansen Initiative, named after the Norwegian diplomat who was the Commissioner for Refugees in the League of Nations and won a Nobel Prize for devising a certificate that allowed refugees after the First World War to travel and resettle. The Nansen Initiative identified at least 50 countries that had in recent decades received and not returned people who had fled across borders because of climate disasters, the greatest number of them in Africa and Central and South America. In analyzing those cases, Nansen found only ad hoc policies, improvised and made up on the fly, to deal with the consequences of these climate change disasters, a complete lack of preparedness internationally to respond to this increasing phenomenon. Given that cross-border migrants who move because of climate are only going to become more common, Nansen made concrete recommendations to all UN member states based on the need to prepare for increased migrant flows in the future. That we collectively build in resilience to prevent displacement with better infrastructure, wiser urban planning, and sensible land reforms. That governments anticipate climate consequences and engage in planned relocation where appropriate. And that when populations are internally displaced, states respond more fully and sensitively to their plight, so they're less likely to flee across a border. These recommendations form part of the Nansen's Protection Agenda, now endorsed by 109 UN member states, but whose global implementation is far from assured. Many low-income countries lack the resources necessary to put mitigation and resilience measures in place. And it's not just lower income countries. We look what happened in British Columbia in the last couple of weeks here in Canada, and we see that even developed countries are sometimes caught flat-footed when extreme weather events occur, and we haven't been able to put in place in advance measures to mitigate the loss. So if climate change and conflict are correlated, and if displacement is common to both and occurs in greater numbers when the two coexist, and if weather-related disasters alone are producing record numbers of the displaced, mostly internal, but also across borders, how should the international community respond, especially at a time when there are more convention refugees than ever before? Well, for those of us who seek to emulate David Petrasek's example, the response to forced displacement, including that caused by climate change, must be based in human rights. And we have so much to learn from the work of John Knox in this connection, and from the work of Cecilia, Jimenez, Damari, and drawing from their experience, drawing from what they've written, and looking at the Human Rights Council's work itself. It's clear that human rights standards and principles can inform and strengthen policy responses to climate change by promoting coherence, legitimacy, and sustainable outcomes. When we address climate change through a rights-based lens, it results in a shared or common perspective, making it easier to formulate strategies that can be adopted everywhere. A rights-based approach not only assists in making policy, it also reveals legal duties and creates a framework to reveal legal obligations so steps can be taken to enforce them. And as Cecilia pointed out, so many human rights are engaged in consequence of climate change and its consequences. The very right to remain alive, the rights to food and water and health and development, sanitation, housing, and most obviously the newly acknowledged right to a healthy environment, recognized just last month, and which John will now take responsibility for. And of course, the UN's Human Rights Committee, in its Teitiata decision last year, took a rights-based approach in concluding that countries may not deport individuals who face climate change-induced conditions that violate the right to life when they present themselves for asylum. Although the claimant's case was dismissed on the particular facts of that case, the committee explicitly recognized that climate change can endanger the right to life, with the result that a decision by states to send a climate migrant back may violate the prohibition against refoulement. The case is an example of how an approach to climate-related displacement rooted in human rights can produce a sensible, humane, and effective response consistent with long-standing international instruments and fundamental values of a universal nature. I conclude by observing that adopting a bold approach firmly rooted in human rights is what David Petrasek would have advocated to address the challenge of climate-related displacement. And perhaps the best way to honor his memory is to do just that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rock, for that very moving and powerful presentation. I have to say, when your fire alarm was going off, my mind immediately went to the famous quote by youth climate activist Greta Thunberg when she made an address aimed at the decision makers of the world. And she said, "I don't want to reassure you. I want you to act like your house is on fire, because your house is on fire." So thank you very much, Professor Rock. And our final speaker, Olivia Lazar, is a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe. Her research focuses on the geopolitics of climate, the transition ushered by climate change, and the risks of conflict and fragility associated to climate change and environmental collapse. Olivia is an environmental peacemaker and mediation practitioner who has worked for various NGOs, the United Nations, the EU, and donor states in the Middle East, Latin America, Sub-Saharan and North Africa, and parts of Asia. Welcome, Olivia Lazar, and I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Linda. I didn't know David, but I'm very touched and honored to be here today because it's very clear that he was an extraordinary person, and the ways in which he's being remembered today very lovingly attests to that. And it seems that his work is indeed very much one that I pursue in my own sphere, looking at ecological integrity, ecological security. And that's what I'd like to speak about today. Following on from Alan, particularly, who started touching upon all these issues relating conflict or intersecting conflict and climate change, I'd like to pick up from there. Also because we're now in a week which has particular significance as the Irish mission to the UN is trying to push for a UN Security Council resolution regarding the relevance of climate change and climate security going forward in responding to conflict. And it's quite ominous because the very first time that this conversation took place in the Security Council was back in 2007. And at the time, and up until today, the question which was being asked was, how would climate change impact conflict, violence, and insecurity? And it was very much focused on this notion that climate change was going to worsen or enhance essentially the fragility factors that play into conflict. As Alan was mentioning, we are not talking about a direct causation, at least not for now. We're talking about disruptions that are likely to essentially sort of, create more natural, disruptions playing into human system disruptions and causing displacement, but not only. We're also looking at livelihoods collapse. We're looking at violence. We're looking at, more widening trust gaps between governance systems and their people. But I'd like to actually focus on a different aspect of the relationship between climate change and conflict, which moves away the conversation from tail-end impacts, which has been the focus of the question which was asked for a really long time at the Security Council about climate security. Because the problem with the question and the way in which it was formulated was that it led to another question, which was, what was the role of the peacemaking community or development actors, apart from essentially handling disasters and being in constant crisis management? Because up until today, we're talking about the climate crisis as sort of leading to symptoms and emanations that result in climate-related disasters. We're talking about drought, we're talking about flooding, we're talking about fire. And since a couple of years ago, we've been talking also about locust invasions and things like this. But we need to switch our understanding of the climate crisis, which is something that is already obviously happening and happening at a very fast pace, but it's also unfolding. And there are different reasons for this unfolding crisis. And that's the part which I want to focus on today. And I'll start sharing very quickly my screen in order for you to visualize something which is important. We've essentially focused the conversation on insecurity and conflict and violence outside of, the United States, outside of Europe, and in the places that were already affected by conflict and violence. And studies such as the one done by CREDP focus on, how climate vulnerable certain countries which are already recipients of UN peacekeeping missions are going to experience more and more violence as a result of their climate vulnerability. The part which was less tackled for the last 15 years of conversation is actually the part where we understand that conflict and fragile zones are instrumental. They're completely central in the fight against climate change. And there is a reason for this. It's quite simply that scientists tell us today that the global regeneration priority areas are actually located in fragile and conflict zones. And this map shows essentially all the priority areas which are in red and orange, which are located in between the tropics and in very direct upper and lower latitudes. It doesn't mean, for example, that the white zones on this map are not supposed to receive regeneration efforts. Quite the contrary, places such as the Sahel and Iraq and Afghanistan need to be part essentially of the efforts relating, conflict resolution with regeneration priorities. But we need to focus very much on this sort of red and orange belt. And now, the reason why this is important is because there hasn't been a recognition, or at least enough of a recognition of how much nature as a whole is part of conflict economies and have been feeding essentially transnational crime, connections, as well as survival economies in places that are affected by poverty and underdevelopment, but also very much, how different conflict stakeholders try to gain access to different types of resources, let it be timber, water, biodiversity, such as vegetal or animal biodiversity, as well as mineral and fossil resources that are part and parcel of an ecosystem. And since we've been essentially sort of, shifting towards a globalized sense of insecurity, we are, seeing more and more some connections between transnational crime, between conflict economies, and between, ecological disruptions. And it's a very, recognized fact by now that countries that are more ecologically degraded experience exponential potential for conflict and violence, which in turn also contributes to ecological degradation and disintegration. And this is something that we're not seeing just at localized or national levels anymore. It follows a pattern which is essentially internationalized and which now very much threatens the remaining ecosystems that we need in order to fight climate change. And it's not just a matter of those ecosystems such as the Congo Basin or the Amazon Basin being carbon sinks. It's also very much recognizing that these ecosystems provide what we call ecological services at local levels in the form of soil health and productivity, in the form of water cycling and availability, protection against pandemics, protection against disasters and extremes, and very much a part and parcel of this notion of human security. And rebounding on what John was saying, ecosystems are actually the standing guardians of any healthy environment, and it goes at the local level as well as the global level. So this is very much something that we need to recognize. And for long, there was this this notion within the peacemaking community that climate change was something which was marginal to their mandate. They wanted to do something about it, but they didn't know what and they didn't know how. And when we start flipping the question essentially from how will climate change impact conflict and violence to how do conflicts, violence, and transnational crime impact climate change, contribute to climate change, and contribute to ecological collapse, then we can start finding an entry point for the peacemaking community, for the development community, and for the security communities to really start reshifting their mandate in a time of climate disruption and climate crisis. So then the question becomes essentially how? And there are two ways in which I'd like to, I'd like to explore today. Exploring is a bit of an expensive word for 10 minutes of conversation, but two key elements that I'd like to focus on. The first one is obviously one of analysis, because this is where everything starts when we start talking about how to navigate conflict, how to stabilize conflict, and how to resolve over time. The very first step is understanding the power systems, the insecurity systems that are at play within conflict. And one entry point is actually to sort of reshift analytical systems to the ecosystems level, which allows to understand the health of an environment in the first place and the state of functioning of ecological services that provide any actor, any population, any community, and the state actors as well, with the basic notion of stable security that is the beginning of any other dimension of security, human, political, and economic, and so on. And by trying to really understand, conflict from a mapping exercise on the basis of ecosystems, we can actually also understand the relationship between communities and natural resources, whatever they are, positive or negative, exploitative or regenerative. We can understand essentially how different ecological dynamics, disintegrative or regenerative, contribute to stability or insecurity and violence. And we can also understand, and this is a matter of sort of, layering analysis, we can also understand how state systems organize their administration from a territorial and governance perspective, but also, as we go along in the analysis, how power and different types of elite bargains prey on natural resources and undermine the ability of ecosystems to provide the necessary services for sustainable security and regeneration over time. So this is very, very important. And one of the key things that I'd like to convey here is that the ecosystems level analysis should not be only sort of remote in terms of an instrument that helps to visualize different dynamics around conflict. It can also be actually very inclusive. And one of the ways in which we can use ecosystems analysis in processes that are inclusive, that are, participatory, is to actually involve communities, state actors, and conflict stakeholders in ecosystem service analysis. It literally gives an element of mapping of how different actors relate to the various services, from the very basic ones in terms of, again, productivity of the ecosystem, to the cultural one, which often include also the political relationship to the ecosystem. So particularly in places which were outlined in red and orange in the previous map, we're thinking also of how to involve indigenous communities that have a very, very strong cultural, spiritual, and lively relationship with ecosystems. And this needs to be taken into account into how to understand the role of ecosystems in conflict resolution. But the other thing, and the one which is even more prescient for the peacemaking community today, is to understand that there is a very, very strong imperative to include what I call nature-based processes, not solutions, within peace processes. And we need to understand that there is a very, very strong potential in including regeneration-oriented scenario building, confidence measures, and actual implementation of regeneration processes for various reasons. One is that we can actually indeed create confidence as long as we introduce regenerative processes in an inclusive and participatory ways with conflict stakeholders. The second thing is, as a practitioner of mediation and peacemaking, I've long been nurtured or educated in this notion that in order to have proper mediation, we need to grow the pie. We should not divide it. But in certain places, especially ones that are affected by scarcity and natural scarcity, this is actually something which is very hard, which is why the peacemaking community has actually resorted to dividing access to natural resources, particularly ones that generate monetization and financial gains, and which has created implicitly competition and structural competition between conflict stakeholders to try and sort of generate access to monetary values from natural resources. There is an interest in shifting that to how do conflict stakeholders in communities actually work together and cooperate to regenerate natural resources and ecosystems over time, so that they all benefit from various aspects of security, stability, and financial gains. And this is something which is, particularly important now, as we have particularly agreed or come out of COP26 with an agreement on what is called the Article 6 of the Paris Rulebook, which establishes, this notion of carbon markets. There is a potential essentially to redirect some international funding from carbon markets to places that are hosting, the key ecosystems that regulate the global climate regime, and therefore generate, directly some financial interest for the peacemaking community and for conflict stakeholders to try and keep those ecosystems in place over time and to regenerate them. And lastly, I'd like to focus on one very concerning issue, which the peacemaking community and the development communities need to keep an eye on, which is not something that we've had to deal with so much over the last few years, but a horizon that we'll have to deal with over the next 20. We are now in a critical juncture of human history where we are under the imperative to decarbonize and to do so extremely quickly, all the while maintaining the ecosystems that help to regulate the global climate regime. But there is, however, an unfortunate tension within the decarbonization and nature positive agendas, which is essentially that the critical materials that are needed for the digital and the decarbonization transition are concentrated outside of China, but in the very same ecosystems that we need to protect. And we're talking again about the Amazon and the Congo Basin. We're talking about places like Myanmar and Indonesia. And we are talking also about the deep seas or certain parts of marine areas that are also contested. That means that we're now entering a new era of geopolitical competition for resource scrambling, at the heart of which stand conflict and fragile zones. That has two implications. The first one is that the competition for those resources is likely to actually strengthen predatory politics and elite bargains that lead or often result in more marginalization, more displacement, potentially more violent, and in some places, some conflicts. And the second implication is that those, if we go into mining and extractive economics within those places, Linda, but you have your hand up and I need to finish within 1 minute. The implication is essentially that we run a risk essentially of mining in places that need to remain in place for ecological services, which are provided at local level, which are extremely important for the local populations, but also of global critical importance. But the part which is particularly concerning is the fact that if we mine even more, if we disturb those ecosystems even more, then that means that our decarbonization transition, however much it is necessary, may actually embed water scarcity within itself. And what we've discovered, particularly over the last 20 years with groundbreaking scientific work, is that those ecosystems are actually responsible for water cycling, not just at local levels, but they're responsible for water cycling and water distribution across different regions, across different continents. And the role of the peacemaking, development, and security communities going forward is very much going to be about investing and integrating regeneration processes within peace processes and peace process design. But it is also going to be about how do we prevent actually ecological disruptions, climate disruptions, as well as more fragility, which is embedded within the decarbonization transition. I'll stop there for now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Wow. Gosh, that is a lot to process. It's very sobering, but again, very encouraging to think that people like you are bringing these issues to the fore and the really intricate interconnections between sustainability and human rights, particularly in the context of conflict and forced migration. Thank you. So we have time for Q&A, and I do have one question. So please do post your questions in the Q&A, and we'll open with this one from an anonymous attendee. And I think this could go to anyone on the panel. So whoever feels inspired, go ahead and jump in. Here's the question. Do you think the increasing securitization of the climate change issue by international institutions will help or hinder the human rights goals for individuals being affected by climate change? Who would like to take a stab at that one? I can also repeat the question. Great, Olivia, let's hear from you. Thank you.
It's a great question. And it relates to, at least I have related it in my own research, to the way in which the question was originally framed. Because if you only frame it from the perspective of how will climate change impact conflict, and you do not give, the opportunity for the peacemaking, development, security communities, even humanitarian actors to respond preemptively, and to really sort of, deal with local drivers of climate disruptions within conflict and fragile zones, but these communities have nothing to do with industrial responses to climate change, then it means essentially that you only give a voice to the tail end impact managers. And those people are the humanitarian actors and growingly military actors. And our focus at Carnegie Europe has focused very much on the European Union. And we've seen, a flurry of different policy changes over the last 10 years, which were very convincing and which are very forward thinking in terms of water diplomacy, climate diplomacy, how to adapt, security systems to climate disruptions. But there was always, a lag and actually a lack of transformation between the policy aspect and the response. So the response today is how to build up, defenses in terms of migratory systems within the European Union and how to equip military actors to be active within more hostile environments. Now, this is where I find that there is a very hopeful and positive agenda, essentially, to focusing particularly on nature-based processes, on regenerative paradigms, on new types of, reflections about industrial and economic, sort of transformations that are now relevant to global conflict prevention and global stability. And this is why, we need to also think, and this is something that we're doing at Carnegie Europe, as to how to push institutional actors and capability actors, including the military, to pivot towards transformation of their agenda, towards prevention, towards understanding climate risks as something which is unfolding. And it's not just, happening within 5 to 10 years. We need to understand how ecological depletion or disintegration currently contributes to climate disruptions and makes certain areas more climate vulnerable, and how we can actually tap into the capability of certain actors that have tremendous operational capacity to contribute to ecosystems level regeneration, because by now this is what we need. So in some places which are conflict and fragile affected, you very much need to anchor your regenerative processes within inclusive and participatory processes, as I was saying, because this is about conflict sensitivity, it's about doing no harm, but it's also about creating the incentives and the direction of change that people can ascribe to and shape by themselves. But there are also some, other levels of how to do regeneration, which is a lot more complex and it requires also indeed deploying actors such as the military, such as even, humanitarian actors and development actors to how do we, for example, regenerate entire areas around the Niger Delta in the Central Sahel, or in the Sinai Peninsula, or in the Central Asian republics. Obviously, we're not talking about interfering with, foreign military actors into places that do not, that should not receive, foreign actors for, especially military actors for that type of work. But if we look at, for example, NATO has a number of partnerships around the world with countries such as Egypt, Mauritania, Afghanistan, and there are possibilities essentially to generate collective learning around how to deploy military actors or other types of actors for ecosystems regeneration, and to monitor it from a scientific perspective in order to actually strengthen regeneration processes at global level from a dynamic perspective. So from the securitization agenda, which is mostly defensive, retroactive, and very much about recoiling of nations onto themselves, we need to shift towards an operationalization of what security in a climate disrupted world means today and how that calls for different types of capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Wow, thank you. Thank you very much for that superb answer. We have a question from Joanna Petrasek McDonald. Thank you. Recognizing the need for a human rights-based approach to climate action, is this broad call to action enough to motivate policymakers to pursue this approach? Or is there a particular human right that most motivates people and action and that we should focus our advocacy around? And again, I think this could go to anyone on the panel. Cecilia, do I see?
Yes, I won't take too long because I know there are other questions coming in. Yeah, so I think that's a very good question from Joanna. And it really, I mean, for me, it is human rights violations as a cause also for the risks of climate change, but also the effect of climate change on human rights. So it is for me, you know, a two-edged sword that one has to actually apply. I like what John Knox, Professor John Knox said. It's either that you take a particular right, in this case, the right to environment, and build on that, or you take the other rights and if you want, in my particular case, mainstreaming, you know, the right to the environment. So I think it both works. But what is really important in terms of a human rights-based approach is really addressing duty bearers and rights holders. And particularly for duty bearers, what I have found to be very effective is to say that the human rights approach actually works for you instead of being an obstacle. Because like in the prevention of human rights violations, for example, then in the end of the day, it will be less costly for you. You have much more of encouragement, if you want, for social cohesion, etc. And you won't have, in my particular mandate, you will not necessarily have internally displaced persons. So it actually will work for the benefit of the government and for the benefit of the state. And naturally, it's the rights bearers that actually benefit from that approach as well. So I wouldn't be too dogmatic or categorical with regard to how you can do it. For me, I'm a practitioner. For me, what works, works.
I agree with that. And I want to say also that as someone who served in government, as well as from the side of NGO advocacy, this call to action is not enough. Relying on one human right is not enough. It's going to take a broad-based, continuous, and persistent effort to persuade those who make decisions about these things to change their ways to reflect human rights in their policies and approaches. And I'm afraid to say a lot of that's going to have to depend on self-interest. How long did it take us to wake up to the fact that human-based emissions are causing the very catastrophes we're talking about? It's grudgingly accepted now, but in many quarters, it's still not. And we live in a world, don't forget, where the global south has not largely been vaccinated because the global north has not shared and distributed. So I think looking to appeal to self-interest and if we explain that migration, which is unregulated, forced, sudden, produces very disruptive political consequences for those in power. And so it's in your interest to invest in the kind of mitigation and resilience efforts that the Nansen Initiative refers to. It's in your interest to worry about the right to life of individuals threatened by climate change consequences. The advocacy is going to have to be intense and of long duration for us to impact policies in that regard. And certainly the call to action today is not by itself enough.
Maybe I could just add that I don't think anyone working in this area really thinks that calling policymakers to action by reminding them that human rights are affected is all that effective. I don't think that's the path to success. I don't have any optimism that policymakers are suddenly going to get, to realize the scales will fall from their eyes. I don't think that will happen. I think the things that make a difference are, well, first, voting people out and voting other people in if you're in a country that's able to do that. I think that matters. But the effect of, I think where a human rights approach has been most effective has been where it's been used by civil society as an additional tool that combines with other tools to work for change. And that change can, again, result in some cases, maybe through lobbying, and in those cases, more power to them. But in many cases, it helps to mobilize civil society action. And finally, and maybe most concretely, it results in litigation. A human rights-based approach opens up new forums that don't otherwise possibly exist. And that's true in many countries, certainly not all countries, but it's true in many countries around the world not just in the global north, but in the global south as well. And I think, again, we're going to see more and more of that kind of rights-based litigation going forward.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Professor Heather McLeod-Kilmurray. How can human rights assist with the effects of multinational corporations on climate change? I am thinking of the immense actors in the global food system who advocate and persuade national and international policymakers to allow and even encourage the commodification and commercialization of food, which has such devastating impacts on the environment and the human right to food. Could increased focus on human rights to food and environment compel governments and international actors to restructure the systems that empower these huge corporate actors? And she adds, this is important since fixing the global food system could positively affect nearly all of the SDGs and many human rights to water, health, environment, etc. We would like to comment on that.
Well, once again, I think John's point about litigation getting the attention of people with vested interests, if these large corporate interests see a potential liability because someone is calling them to account for the consequences of their approaches, I think that's how you modify behavior. You know, class actions have done an enormous amount of good in modifying behavior in a judicially efficient way for large numbers of people, drawing to the court's attention widespread consequences from tortious or otherwise unlawful conduct by corporate and other interests. So I think I'm with John, especially as a former litigation lawyer. I have confidence that one way to get to the self-interest of people who make decisions exercising power is to expose them to liability, and insightful regulation enforced by effective litigation could very well be one avenue to that result.
Agreed. And Professor McLeod-Kilmurray and I are actually co-authors of the Canadian Law of Toxic Torts, so we will always be on side for that kind of approach. Cecilia.
Yeah, I just would like to add something, and that is we're not ever going to get change at all unless there is some serious organizing being done. And this is one of the themes that I've really adopted when I entered since I was appointed as UN Special Rapporteur, is the right of the rights holders, and it's a right to actually participate in decisions affecting them. I mean, this is such a basic right. And so when I presented my first report to the General Assembly, everybody was saying, oh, yes, of course. But, you know, it's taking that not merely rhetorical, but also seriously. And since then, I have been working not only with UN agencies, for example, in their operational programming, for example, in just such important things as humanitarian assistance, to ensure that they just not merely consult people who are supposed to be beneficiaries, but that we actually debunk the word beneficiaries, because we'd like to see people as rights holder and that they have the right to organize themselves. They have a right to be on the podium. They have the right to actually talk power to power. And so what I would like to add to what Alan has mentioned is that underlying this, be it litigation or movement in the streets or advocacy in any form at all, is really organizing of the people concerned. And that will include what John said, also, you know, to vote people out of power and vote in those who should be there. So it's really organizing, and that reflects the fact I come from the field.
Thank you. John.
Well, I agree with all of that. I just would note that along these lines, in May of this year, a district court in the Netherlands ordered Royal Dutch Shell to reduce its emissions by 45% by 2030 relative to 2019. And again, that decision was based on human rights. So that's, again, not all countries are going to have courts that will hear these arguments, but some will. And the decision, it's important to note, was not just limited to Shell's operations in the Netherlands or something like this. Shell's based in the Netherlands, but the order was with respect to all of its operations everywhere. Mm-hmm. Shell's appealing, but if it's upheld, that's going to be a I think, a harbinger of more things like that to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. We have a final question from Annelies Bloch before I hand the microphone over to her. And this question is as follows. How can we go about balancing the need to address climate change with the recognition that climate solutions can and will cause human rights violations and or contribute to destabilizing already vulnerable regions? What happens when we have competing human rights claims, e.g. local communities and offsetting or green energy projects?
I thought this point was illustrated so well by Olivia's map, identifying places in the world where we need to extract essential materials in order to create batteries for electric cars or otherwise transform society and its practices into a greener and cleaner way of life. So Annelies' question puts a fine point on it. When you bring your equipment into the central part of a country to extract those minerals necessary for a green initiative, what do you do about the local community that's thereby disrupted? Well, I think, you know, it takes thoughtful and sensitive policy making to think about compensation, to think about providing employment opportunities for that community. We face this in Canada, where there are Indigenous peoples disrupted by mining or pipelines or other activities. And it means sincere and meaningful consultation. It means free and informed consent on the part of Indigenous people. But it also means a variety of ways in which you can rehabilitate the land if it's affected by your activity, compensate and otherwise recompense those who are affected directly. And those are my initial thoughts.
Olivia?
Thank you very much. It's a really hard question because it's about competing priorities for security. And I suppose for the first time in such a prescient way, we now have a really strong urgency at a global level to decarbonize. And there is no question about the need to decarbonize. Now, the question is how we do it and how we do it collectively. The issue, once again, with the way in which climate change was framed for a really long time and remains framed up until today, including within the race to net zero, is essentially that within Europe, within Canada, within the US, within Australia, we are relying on a narrative which is now politically accepted that we can keep on going with economic growth as long as we decouple our economic growth or economic trajectories from greenhouse gases, particularly from carbon dioxide emissions. There are two issues with that. One, it is not scientifically proven that we can for sustained periods of time. Second, decoupling economic trajectories from greenhouse gas emissions, and particularly from carbon dioxide, means that we recouple our economic trajectories with mineral extraction, which in and of itself, as I was trying to explain, contributes to climate disruptions and fragility in other places. So maybe it is time, and I believe and I suspect that it will happen very quickly, particularly as we encounter more and more difficulties with the race to net zero rather than zero. The reality is that we're going to have to shift our framing, our understanding of the problem from just one of carbon dioxide emission to one of resource use, which will essentially question the way in which wealth is concentrated and distributed, not just at national levels, but across the globe, which will indeed, raise and inflame some questions about power relationships between the global north writ large and the global south writ large. One of the key things to remember in this conversation is whilst conversation about neocolonialism are useful from an intellectual frame, we've seen at COP26 how little useful they are when it comes to negotiations, because they actually inflame a lot of or sort of, widen issues that prevent essentially constructive negotiations and really moving towards collective and global solutions, there is a need, as Alan was saying, to really empower indigenous communities, which are the guardians of the ecosystems that we need to protect, and who are often, managing to protect against the unlawful and abusive exploitation of certain critical areas in those critical ecosystems. Now, there are other conversations that need to take place in the scientific community, and they already are. There is a sort of overarching question whether or not it is possible to avoid terrestrial mining and rather to go into marine deep sea, particularly deep sea mining, so as to not have any impact directly on human populations who may suffer the ills from extractive economics and extractive ventures. The problem is that we don't know from a biophysical perspective what the consequences of deep sea mining are going to be for the local areas, but also from a global perspective, because we need to take into account ecological interdependencies. And we need to sort of, look at whether or not there are some places called sacrifice zones that can be exploited without sort of, creating some human rights issues and ecological disruptions. This is also one of the avenues that the scientific community is looking at today. But all of these questions at the end of the day are very technical on the one hand, because they have to do with how much can we satisfy demand for the decarbonization economy? And they have to do then with an issue of political and economic transformation, which have to take place first and foremost in the global north writ large, about how to consider different types of economic growth and not, constant consumerism and productivism, and how to essentially make sure that there is a global redistribution of wealth.
Thank you so much. I think we could keep talking for many hours, and I certainly would love to keep listening for many hours, but it is.
Linda, can I just really briefly say on this last point?
Yes.
And at least there's actually been quite a bit of work done on this. With respect, I don't think we totally really answered your specific question. And so I realize we're out of time here. If you want to email me or something, I'm happy to point you in the direction of the work that's been done on this. Again, with respect, I don't actually think this is that difficult technically. This is a very common problem. We want to pursue societal goals in a way that respect the human rights of those who are most affected. It's always easiest to dump the costs on those who have the least power. That's very likely what's going to happen here again. That's happening with respect to indigenous peoples and local communities. It's not because we don't have any options, it's because politically that's the easiest thing to do. The Article 6, there was a lot of work to try and put in safeguards in the Article 6 talks, safeguards for the human rights of those who are most vulnerable. Some of those efforts met with success, others didn't. But anyway, I can kind of point you towards that work if you're interested.
Excellent, thank you. And with that, I will turn the microphone over to Annalise for a closing.
Thank you, Professor Collins. I'd just like to take a few minutes of our remaining time to say a couple of words on behalf of my family and I. So this forum, along with the David Petrasek Legacy Fund and the previous event on human rights in COVID times, is part of a larger initiative to carry forward the work and legacy of my father, David Petrasek. The aim of these initiatives is to foster empowerment, connections, debate, and change. My father believed passionately in a world of universal human rights protection, and towards that essential vision, he was deeply committed to creating innovative opportunities for learning, for strategizing, and for advancing practical solutions. Over the years, he worked on numerous issues, including on refugee protection, on migration, on human rights advancement, and in conflict resolution. So this year's topic was chosen with sort of, the breadth of his work in mind. Indeed, as our panelists have shown, climate change touches upon all of these areas, if not many, many more. My father was also really devoted to bringing people together to discuss the future and challenges in achieving human rights for all, and to ensure that human rights responds to challenges that we face as human beings in a changing world. Indeed, he believed in fostering inclusive conversation, and as many if not any of his friends and family could attest to, he enjoyed few things more than a really spirited discussion and debate. So it therefore really means a lot to us that we could have this forum today, that we could carry forward his work and legacy in this fashion through thoughtful conversation as we imagine new strategies for the advancement of human rights. In this vein, I'd really like to thank all of the individuals and organizations who made this event possible. In particular, I want to thank the speakers for their kind words regarding my father and for their insightful comments and remarks, which have given me at least a lot to think about. So thank you to Special Rapporteurs Cecilia, Jimenez, Damari, Professor John Knox, Olivia Lazar, and Professor Alan Rock. I'd also like to thank you, Professor Linda Collins, for your thoughtful moderation. And lastly, thank you to the University of Ottawa's Human Rights Research and Education Center, the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs, the Dialogue Advisory Group in Amsterdam, and the World Migration and Refugee Council for partnering to make this discussion possible. We're all so grateful for you for joining us today in remembering David Petrasek and in advancing his work.
Thank you so much for that eloquent and inspiring closing. Clearly, your father's legacy is alive and well and in very good hands. I will pass it over to John Packer to conclude.
Thank you very much, Professor Collins, and thank you for everyone for contributing today. I must say, I feel I shouldn't say anything after Annalise's remarks, and I'm thinking very clearly of many enjoyable and vigorous times with David and family over such issues. It does follow me just to say a few words. This is an event in our 40th anniversary of the Human Rights Research and Education Center, which was created to bring human rights specifically into Canadian law and our Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which will enjoy its 40th anniversary this coming spring. And in that regard, we're delighted to be able to be supporting this event, which touches such a topical matter that's really going to be with us for a long time. I think presents dilemmas. I will just say one word that I was reminded today in reading a news item that Canada is apparently to produce 30 million tons of lithium over the next few years. So apparently we're going to face dilemmas. But I am quite convinced from my own professional experience, and I know David Petrasek was also, that this is not irreconcilable with a human rights-based approach that can ensure full lives and dignity and freedom for all. Let me, in that regard, mention that today is Giving Tuesday, at least in North America, and the David Petrasek Legacy Fund has been established to support those young people who will follow in David's footsteps. So I draw attention to that. And then finally, let me say that we have 3 events coming in the next week or so, which are in the same spirit. On the 3rd of December, we have Bruce McIver and his book, Standoff, about exactly reconciliation in Canada with Indigenous peoples and over some of these issues. And he will be launching that book with us on the 3rd of December. Please watch for that. And then on the 9th of December, which is the anniversary of not only the Genocide Convention, but also Human Rights Defenders International Day, we have 2 remarkable speakers from representing Rohingya and Uyghur communities under enormous threat and pressure, and both affected by precisely some of these issues today. And finally, on the 10th of December, the anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we have our close colleague and friend, Alex Neve, also a close friend of David Petrasek and family. He will be hosting a meeting of 3 Canadian special rapporteurs of the United Nations system to talk about their role and experiences. So please join us, watch for those, join us. And again, thanks to everyone. This it has been recorded, will be available both in recording form and in summary textual form in the near future. Thank you so much to everyone. Have a nice rest of the day.